Hello and
Hola y bienvenidos a la reunión de primavera de 2023 del Grupo Banco Mundial y FMI. Soy Shakuntala Shantiran, Shak, y seré la moderadora de este evento, a acelerar el desarrollo en una era de crisis mundial. En la próxima hora nos centraremos en las enormes crisis de desarrollo que enfrenta el mundo en la actualidad, desde los impactos climáticos a la pandemia nacional puede para un futuro más resiliente, inclusivo y sostenible. Recuerden que pueden compartir sus opiniones sobre estos temas en cualquier momento usando el hashtag #ReshapingDevelopment. Use el código el director gerente sobre desarrollo del Banco Mundial, Su Excelencia, el señor José Campo, ministro de Hacienda y Crédito Público de Colombia, la señora Leila Benali, ministra de Transición Energética y de
Bank. And we have Amina J. Mohammed, the Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations and Chair of the UN Sustainable Development Group, who will be joining us later in the program. So we have a global crisis with multiple dimensions, overlapping, interconnected challenges. We need change to accelerate development. Axel, what is the World Bank doing to help developing countries? How is that help evolving? How must it evolve amid these many challenges?
So we have learned a lot over the last 3 years, and first and foremost, you have to deal with the crisis, but as a development organization should never take your eye off the long-term challenges. So you need to meet a double task, crisis management.
Nunca debemos dejar de tener los ojos en la meta, pensar en desarrollo a largo plazo, y como lo que precisamos es reaccionar de manera rápida.
You can no longer do this alone because these are global challenges. COVID is global, climate is global. So what you need to do is you need to work in concert and to do this. So that has been the actually good news, that we have been as an organization be able to respond to these challenges. But there are enormous outstanding challenges as the SDGs are hopelessly off track. Climate change is off track. We have increased fragility. So we need more resources, and we need to see how we can, in a time of fiscal stress by countries, mobilize the necessary resources, but also tap increasingly into private sector resources so they can accompany our efforts, be it in middle-income countries, be it in the low-income countries.
We are going to be hearing from the private sector a little later on with Dan. Axel, you've been meeting a lot of countries, clients here at the spring meetings. What are they asking for? What do they need?
Well, I think most need more. And I think there's a difference here, particularly with the low-income countries. They have been badly hit, and unfortunately, they will need more. They are greatly concerned about the debt situation that is coming up, but they have also been battling the food crisis. So they need that multiple support. We are trying to provide additional resources to IDA, and we are trying to set up a crisis facility that that could provide additional supplementary support, and we are going to engage the donors next week on this. For the middle-income countries, they have also their challenges, but there are also the expectations are high in terms of climate financing. There has to be more on the table. And therefore, I think the reform process that's going on in the bank is not only taking into account these global challenges, but we should stay focused also on poverty. We need to do this all together, but we need additional resources, and that is the name of the game.
Thank you, Axel. Let's welcome now Amina J. Mohammed to the stage. Hello there. Thank you for joining us. Ms. Mohammed is Deputy Secretary General of the United Nations. Let's jump right in if we can, Ms. Mohammed. So we are hearing that change is needed. Is change afoot as well with how the UN is approaching the Sustainable Development Goals? We heard Axel just now saying that it's off track. We've heard the UN Secretary General saying that the world is far off track to achieving the SDGs by 2030. So how is the UN getting back on track?
Thank you. Well, there we go. Women always hit the ground running. Thank you. Well, look, we are off track. We were off track before COVID. It exacerbated it. And then we had, of course, the war in Ukraine, and that's done even worse. However, what we are doing at the UN is to mobilize at the global level on the issues that we can bring to the table, whether it is finance, it is the transitions on energy, on food, and to agree how we will go about landing those at the country level. That's a partnership discussion. It's a partnership discussion with the international community. It's one with the private sector. It is one, most importantly, with national governments, making sure that their priorities are the ones that we are supporting, and that we're engaging key constituencies of youth and of women. Now, the SDGs, we will have a summit this year. It's a stock take. It is in the midst of crisis, and we've heard all through these last few days how bad that is. The means of implementation are not yet there, and that's, you know, the discussions that we have today. How can the institutions with what they have become more effective? But how can we also really think through to the future, which is now? Our institutions that were built that many years ago are no longer fit for purpose, and we have to recognize that, and we have to recognize that both the ownership, the structures, and the responses need to be different. Again, discussions that are happening here today. Many of the issues we've picked up have been that of the debt crisis, which is very real for over 52 countries today. We need to find ways of addressing that with restructuring debt, but we also need access, and we need liquidity, and we need long-term accessible funding. This is, we know, is available, but we need the political will to open up those doors for many developing countries so that we can meet the promises of the Sustainable Development Goals. The partnerships start with us in the international community, within the UN, within the IFIs. We're here in DC at the World Bank because those partnerships matter on the ground, and we've done considerable amount of work together in very difficult crises and humanitarian settings. But it needs to go further. It needs to scale up, and so we welcome that the shareholders have, again, given us another tool, the evolution roadmap for the bank, that hopefully will get the ambition to help us do the job on the ground.
So we're talking about the need for partnership, the need to mobilize resources across sectors. How closely is the UN working with the World Bank and with the private sector?
Well, with the World Bank, day in day, we have work that we do on the ground together. In the most recent crisis settings in Yemen, in the response that we got phenomenal resources from different partners in Pakistan. These were two major climate responses. But with the country teams, when we're speaking about the energy transitions, so the digital transformations on the ground, the food systems, more recently the education transformation summit, this is again another area that we're working with the World Bank on the ground. With the private sector, a little more difficult. The private sector was a key stakeholder in shaping the Sustainable Development Goals. And many private sector companies have looked at their business models and with the UN Global Compact have come to the table. But I think what we're needing to see is the scale of that participation and more engagement with business in the north and business in the south. This is a huge opportunity. We're hoping that some of the work that we're doing with the bank that will look to leveraging more resources from the private sector will do just that. And how that happens needs to have the private sector in the room. So if I would say there is a challenge, not yet in the room. They're missing in action. And while they may be doing very well on the outside, what they need to be doing within development and together with the international community is still a challenge, I think, that we have to address.
We're going to hear Dan's perspective on that very shortly, a little later in our conversation. First, thank you very much, both, for giving us that global perspective from your international organizations. Let's dive into some specific country experiences now and solutions. So conflict and violence, political and economic instability continue to force people to flee their homes. Colombia is taking a very different approach from much of the world to how it's managing its migrant flows from neighboring countries. Instead of being anti-immigration, you're taking an inclusive approach, including ensuring that refugees, that migrants have access to basic services and livelihoods. Minister Ocampo, how is Colombia managing this? What kind of policies have you implemented?
Yeah, well, thank you very much, and very nice to be in this panel. Let me say that actually Colombia should be seen as one of the world examples of how to manage an unexpected flow of migrants. We had a massive migration of Venezuelans due to the crisis of Venezuela, and Colombia basically adopted the mechanism that goes from temporary absorption of the migrants to more permanent mechanisms to allow them to settle in the country. And one of the good things about the policy, I must say, was the fact that the country looked at all the needs of migrants. Of course, easier from the point of view of government to absorb, for example, access to education for children, access to health for all the family members, and of course working to allow them to settle in the housing and less so, but trying to also get them employment, which is of course I must say Colombia has absorbed a lot of employment from Venezuelans in a positive way. That actually, by the way, is, you can say, is part of a broader process, that not only involves migrants, but also one area which is critical for Colombia, which is the faraway communities within the country, as part of the peace processes in which we are involved. So trying to also to promote the development of faraway municipalities, for example, where and again with an integrated approach, in a sense, taking into account all the SDGs of the United Nations, trying to see, for example, access to education, to health, to housing, to water and sanitation, to electricity, to technology, information technology for faraway regions, which is and generally to all forms of infrastructure, for including, of course, the information technology. Yeah.
What kind of help did you get from the international, or support from the international community to make this happen?
Well, we did get significant support, including, by the way, from the World Bank in that regard. But many, let's say, for many of these processes, we have had significant international cooperation. But let me say, in any case, that the country had to dedicate resources of its own to many of these issues, let's say, for example, for the education and health systems, basically were Colombian resources that were put into this process. Yeah.
So with political will and collaboration with development partners, progress in the refugee crisis is possible. Let's take a look now at energy, which is a very big piece in the climate change puzzle. Minister Benali, Morocco has implemented some strategies to reduce its dependence on external sources of energy. How is your country using green renewable energy to create growth and jobs, and also to promote regional stability?
Yeah. Thank you first for this, for the invitation to this panel. I think this is a great question because it really encompasses and summarizes Morocco's energy strategy since 2009. And that strategy has been stable over time. And I would say the first key factor in any energy strategy is stability. We have three key pillars. You mentioned renewables. So, of course, we have that target of exceeding 42% of our installed capacity based on renewables. We reached it. And we have a new target of 52% of our installed capacity based on renewables before 2030. And mind you, that's because Morocco has been one of the very first countries to revise its NDCs to be aligned with Paris, and we are very much taking that into account in our energy strategy. Second key pillar is efficiency. Efficiency on the demand side, but also on the supply side, and how you produce, how you transport, and how you consume energy. And third key pillar is actually regional integration. And there we were putting to test 4 months before the Russia-Ukraine war, in the sense that we had a 10 BCM transcontinental pipeline from Algeria to Europe crossing Morocco, in which 10% of our installed capacity was relying on. And this pipeline went idle, totally empty. So we had to do what Ukraine did, actually. We reversed that pipeline to get access to the international gas market. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because it boils down to your question about energy security. Having an integrated regional market and having access to international energy markets in an inclusive manner is quite key in our energy strategy. And I think we demonstrated it. Luckily, we had to do it before the war, so we were ready when there was the war. And despite, I would say, the volatility in commodity prices, we were able to, before the summer of 2022, have access to the international LNG market. But that's just one example of how, I would say, market integration can give you regional stability, and where energy security can give you regional stability. So we were able actually to work with our European counterparts at the time when even diplomatic relationships were a bit strained, to work on a very kind of unique setup to get access to the international energy market. Now, to get that triangle stable over time, I think two things that are now a bit of concern is the fact that these series of multifaceted crises that the world is living in the 21st century, including climate, but not only, is pushing for more fragmentation and protectionism in markets. And that's one thing that we are trying as the Kingdom of Morocco to convince our international partners that market integration is really key in keeping that mutual dependence and energy security for everyone to have a just transition and future. And a second, I would say, small concern that we're having, because Morocco having that 20 years of experience in pushing for renewable projects, now we're having the second wave of renewable projects, is the ability for the international financial community, including the merchant banks and international financial institutions, to take into account climate risk in financing renewable projects. So today, we're having developers concerned about financing solar plants or wind farms or hydro projects because they're not sure that of the performance of those plants in 10 years, 20 years' time because of the change in seasonal patterns, change in wind patterns, etc. So these are two key areas that we are watching very carefully in our strategy.
Thank you, Minister Benali, for showing us that energy security is important for regional stability. And we're now going to hear about an example of how regional cooperation is so vital from Dr. Ouma. The Africa CDC has been key in enhancing how the region can respond to and its pandemic preparedness. It actually responded to the COVID-19 pandemic better than originally predicted. How did Africa as a continent do that?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting the Africa CDC to participate in this. Now, you're right that Africa CDC performed much better than had been predicted. I would like to say that Africa CDC was the best performing intergovernmental organization during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I say that because under the constraints that the continent had, the kind of results that we produced were unprecedented in many ways. And during a crisis, there are three things that are very important. One is decisions must be made, whether they are easy decisions, they are difficult decisions, they are right decisions or wrong decisions, they must be made. Second is they must be made quickly because you are in an emergency. And third, those decisions must have resources attached to them so that they can be implemented. And we did all three in the following ways. At the beginning of the pandemic well, at least our first case on the continent was in the middle of February of 2020. The chairperson of the African Union at that time was President Ramaphosa of South Africa. And he took the unprecedented direction of convening his peers every 2 weeks. The heads of states of the continent met in excess of 14 times in 2020 alone. And they were not meeting just to talk. Each session, a decision was being made. And those decisions, the result is the success of Africa CDC that you see. So they made decisions regularly, and they made them firmly, giving us the confidence to go out and do what we have been instructed to do. They also attached resources to those decisions. First, it was local resources from within African governments, and then the private sector stepped in. And then Friends of Africa, when they posed from their own crisis, also stepped in. Mm-hmm. The World Bank has been a very good friend, and we are coming back to strengthen our friendship in the coming days and weeks. Before the I'm not saying that because I'm in the bank, but before the pandemic, the bank was already supporting Africa CDC in strengthening networking of public health assets in parts of Africa. The pandemic disrupted that, but we had already formed a very good relationship, and in the middle of the pandemic, the World Bank invested again in the Africa CDC for institutional strengthening. I'm allowed to say it is 100 million over 3 or so years, and we are happy that they picked institutional strengthening. So when we look at the way regional efforts come into play, we must appreciate that there are regional institutions that are in place that need to be strengthened so that they can do their rightful mandate of ensuring the region is safe. And when the region is safe, the globe is also safe. We have done that with very good results, and we are absolutely convinced that if we strengthen the Africa CDC further, we will delay the next big outbreak. God forbid another pandemic comes, we will respond to it better with even better results, not just for the continent, but with lessons being learned for the rest of the world.
So, Dr. Ouma, Ahmed, you've been talking about the need for resources. All the solutions we've been hearing about need resources, need funding, and fortunately not enough. We need the resources and engagement of the private sector. Dan? The J.P. Morgan Development Finance Institution, right, was established in 2020 to mobilize finance to support the SDGs in emerging economies. So how successful have you been in mobilizing private sector finance?
Well, I'll get to that, but let me just kind of mention that the spirit in which the J.P. Morgan DFI was initiated is that there is a growing cadre of investors out there that are pursuing what's called a double bottom line. Essentially, they want not only financial returns, but they also want social, economic, or environmental returns as well with their investments. So the key for us was organizing some subset of our existing products and services with a robust framework that involved reporting, intentionality, and standardization. And for a variety of, and this was a similar mechanism to what had happened with the evolution of the green bond market as well, but we wanted to short circuit that, make it go faster, and also make it clear that in the case of the green bond market, in some ways, for reasons we don't need to get into here right now, it actually discriminates a bit against issuers in the emerging markets and developing countries. And in our view, you cannot do development without being focused on climate, and you can't do climate without being focused on development. So we felt that it was appropriate to merge the two in our framework. To do that, we formed an MOU with the IFC, the private sector lending arm of the World Bank, and we adapted what the IFC had been using called the AIM framework, which is an impact measurement framework, towards our much broader array of services. Broader because we have a securities license, the IFC doesn't. But in other respects, our methodology was very similar. And so, for example, it includes certain exclusions that we will not work on. It involves the identification of a development gap for a country. It involves an assessment of the intentions of a development actor, be it the sovereign or be it a corporate. Most of our deals so far have been with corporates. And it also involves an assessment of the intensity with which that corporate or sovereign is actually focused on the development challenges that it has identified ex ante. And then, of course, a robust reporting framework. So our strategy basically had three parts. First, with respect to investors, we felt, as I just said, that if investors know what they're buying, they know what the development impacts that can be, that are expected, that are going to be reported on, that they're more likely to buy an asset if they're pursuing that double bottom line than one that doesn't have that reporting framework around it. Second, issuers, and this was somewhat to our surprise. It turns out that our issuer clients were much more focused on doing a development finance instrument, be it a bond, a loan, a swap, an M&A transaction, an equity deal, than we had anticipated, because they want to tell their own development story. In effect, they're keen to submit themselves to a kind of accountability in finance. Why are they using third-party money to do this? And then fourth is that we thought that this would make us more successful in working with, not in competition with, absolutely with the established multilaterals in the official sector as well as national development finance institutions. So what have the results so far? We launched this in January 2020. As of the end of 22, we had qualified $380 billion across some 1,750 transactions, banking, investment banking, and markets, all of which involved essentially raising of new capital. That's of the totality of JP Morgan's transactions that were qualified and eligible, affecting conditions in the developing world. But perhaps more importantly, our development finance institution team has worked very closely on 42 transactions since January 2020 in working with issuer clients in helping them tell their development stories, helping them extract why are you trying to, how do you see this as being in any way developmental? And then submitting to concrete targets about what they're trying to achieve and agreeing to report on those with a regular cadence. Each of them is tied to the SDGs. We prefer, in our methodology, to relate everything to one or more of the UN SDGs. Others may prefer other frameworks, but we think it works best with the UN SDGs. And I think another very important aspect of this is that we've also identified some 75 investors, ranging from the largest institutional investors in the world that are setting up ESG-oriented funds focused on the developing world, or specialized ESG or impact funds. And just a couple of final observations about our approach. The first is that it's an issuer-oriented approach. It's not a use of proceeds-oriented approach, as is the case, say, for green bonds. Second, it's purely commercial. So we are very explicitly doing this with a profit motive in mind, because we believe that that will help scale it up faster and devote more resources to it, both human and capital. And third, our approach is completely open source. You can see our methodology, our results, everything on our website. And then finally, we are trying to socialize this methodology across the ecosystem working on this activity, whether it's peer institutions, that is sell-side intermediaries like ourselves, asset managers, third-party rating institutions, and multilaterals and bilateral DFIs. We had our first meeting this morning of 27 different entities to try and socialize this, which we hope to be doing over the next several months.
Thank you, Dan. So it can be a win-win situation,
we think so.
Right? You can meet the bottom line and have financial returns as well as development outcomes, positive outcomes, right? We have time now for some questions from our audience. The first, we've selected a few beforehand. The first one is for Ms. Mohammed.
Framework on our existing institution, be more intentional.
So, Ms. Mohammed, Bob Malone asks if the climate crisis, which in his opinion is by far the worst of the crises engulfing the world, cannot be addressed without the support and commitment of the rich countries. Is this happening?
Yeah, it's happening to a degree. I think we've seen progress in the last COPs in Glasgow and Sharm el-Sheikh, and we will go to COP28, we hope, with much more. I think there are many indicators to whether the Paris Agreement has been met or not. And one of those, I would say the handshake for it, again, on the finance side, has always been the 100 billion. It hasn't been met, and as we said, 100 billion is not going to deliver climate action to solve the challenge of our 1.5 degree world. But it is an indicator as to whether the world is going to step up to the commitments that need to be made on many transitions. So I think that we are looking for much more at the stocktake at COP28, but we're already beginning to see that there is a mobilization to do better in our multilateral development banks, to try to leverage the private sector, and to see many more partnerships to get it done, but we're still a way off.
We need words turning into action, right? More concrete action on the ground. So this dovetails into a question from an anonymous viewer for you, Axel. Climate change has its causes from around the world, and especially from more developed countries that pollute more. What can the World Bank Group do to address such a truly global issue, knowing that it traditionally works with developing country clients?
Well, we can do very different things. First, advocacy, that it is a huge problem, and we need to encourage action. That is partly also in line with the SDGs. It is the awareness building and then ultimately the action. So that is one. Secondly, we need to provide the analytical work. We have been working with countries on so-called country climate and development reports to see how you can get to net zero and what are the options available. And then you can bring financing to the table, and clearly every organization should do its maximum. We have been actually over the last 4 years doubling our commitments to 29 billion. But, you know, this is only one organization. I think what we need to look at is we need collectively, we need literally trillions of dollars. And that is the challenge. And so that is where we need to point out what we need to do, and we need to have a long-term commitment on this. So I think we can act in various areas. Finally, we need to have the coalition. The coalition who is aware that can be from the UN system, can be from bilaterals, can be from private sector. We need a voice that is loud and clear that waiting is not an option and waiting has a cost. The cost of inaction is much higher than if we were to act, and we are off track. So I think this is where urgency needs to be transmitted. But ultimately, what we are also saying here at the World Bank has to be translated not in words, it has to be in action, and here in this case, in financing and much higher financing.
So on that subject, back to you, Dan. Briefly, maybe this time, if we could. So there's been much talk about the importance of catalyzing, right, of the World Bank and other multilateral institutions, catalyzing, scaling up private sector engagement, finance, right, to support development goals. How should they be doing that?
Well, I think that they are doing it. Like in our own case that I just gave you with the establishment of the Development Finance Institution at JP Morgan, it was their intellectual property grafted onto our institution that enabled us to launch this and to mobilize $380 billion from the private sector. So, you know, that's not because we were so smart, it's because we're big. So we take their smarts, apply it to our big, and we'll be good. But I don't think that kind of an obsession about financial engineering is going to get us there. I do think that, first of all, I would say the world's governments really do need to scale up the official institutions much, much larger than they currently are. So we are very much in favor of much larger World Bank, much larger regional development banks, much larger bilateral development banks. Just because we think that the private sector can play a multi-billion, perhaps trillion-dollar game, doesn't mean that they are not vitally important. The other thing is that they are by far the largest agglomeration of development experts in the world under this roof. So how can we take that intellectual capital, disseminate it in ways that will attract private investment? I believe that their intellectual capital is as much, if not more important than their financial capital. And so I think the challenge is for them to do things like more project preparation for the private sector to finance. It's standard setting, like they're participating with our Development Finance Institution. It's and kind of making that an industry standard. So that's kind of the sorts of ideas that I think make sense.
Thank you, Dan. Let's squeeze this in. We have an audience question from Charles Mills, and it's for Axel again. So food insecurity has been exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, among many other factors. How is the World Bank, or how can the World Bank help alleviate food insecurity?
Well, they need.
Well, we are now focusing on the food security, but the food has been a problem for a long time. I just recall that in 1974, there was a decision to phase out hunger in 10 years. I think collectively, the world community has failed over the last almost 50 years to do so, and the problem has gotten worse after also the war, but it was already in a very bad situation. what we are doing is, at the bank, we try to respond on two angles. One is the short term. That is a lot on social protection, but you need then to look at the resilience, the resilient agriculture that requires long-term investment. We have said we would provide about up to $30 billion over a 15-month period. We had new financing of $12 billion. The demand was such that we had committed that 6 months early. So it is clearly that there is an urgency to act, but we need to handle the short term and particularly the longer term in agriculture system. What I've also said at the board is, apart from what the countries need to do on reorganizing their agriculture system, it's also necessary that industrialized countries cut their subsidies. But the subsidy, agriculture subsidy, are introducing also enormous distortion in their local agricultural systems and partly are destroying their livelihoods. And that is a huge problem as well.
The Global Economic Commission on the Economics of Water was just talking about the need to do that was to remove or transfer these subsidies to something more effective.
That would be even better.
So thank you very much to our audience for your great questions. We have time for a quick fire round for all our panelists in 1-2 minutes. What is the single most important action that needs to happen or be scaled up to deliver country impacts and global public goods in this very challenging global environment? If we could start with you, please, Ms. Mohammed.
There isn't a single most important action. That's a complete fallacy. This is a complex, integrated response that you need. But for all of it, if there is one that we would say outside of this, it's leadership. Leadership that will actually walk the talk. We have many leaders who have to step up and take the actions behind the solutions that we have here. There are some that have shown that willingness, and we have a number of events this year for that to happen. This is just the first of those events, and I hope that we will see that. So leadership, delivering on what it talks.
So action and not just words. And what about you, Minister Ocampo? What do you think?
Let me actually briefly mention two things. First of all, we need much larger multilateral development banks. The multilateral development bank system has to play a crucial role. Is not only private financing, which of course is essential, but the instability of private financing is a major problem even for emerging economies. So I think the growth of the multilateral development banking system is an essential part of the solution. And let me say that implies capitalizing the World Bank among them, not only for private financing, not only for, let's say, climate change financing, but also for official financing, even for middle-income countries. And the second is international tax cooperation. The advances in that regard done at the OECD inclusive framework were a step forward, but very limited in terms of the effects. Particularly for developing countries, for example, the IMF evaluation say that we got very little from that. So we did a much further push in the direction of strengthening international tax cooperation at the OECD framework, but also in the United Nations, because the Great General Assembly approved at the end of last year a framework to discuss international tax cooperation with the United Nations at the center.
Minister Bernali, what are your thoughts?
I can only agree with the leadership issue that Amina has mentioned. And while waiting for that, while working on creating leaders who can step up, I think we have to work on the mismatch issue, because as you heard in this panel today, there is an availability of pool of funding, either from the IFIs or the private sector. But the real issue, in addition to the gap that we are facing in financing this provision of public goods to the populations, I think there's also, if I take the example of the energy transition, if we all assume that there is the gap of $25 trillion between now and 2030 to win the energy transition, if we all agree that there is a gap of $250 trillion between now and 2050 to win the energy transition, well, then there's clearly a mismatch between the projects and those pool of finance. And how do we do that? Is by working on the reporting framework that Dan was talking about, is making sure that we increase the capacity of, at the country level, in the private sector, in all the constituents in this equation, so that there is more transparency on where that pool of funding is needed to have an impact. So I think the fact that we're having discussions on climate change in one room, security in another room, biodiversity loss in another room, pollution in another one, I think it's creating that mismatch between pool of funding and where it can make real impact. So this is, I think, what I would say while we're working on the leadership issue that Amina has so rightly pointed out.
Ahmed, your thoughts. What's needed?
What's missing?
Oops.
What's missing is the bottle didn't fall down all the way, so that's good. But what's missing is we are not learning lessons and acting differently. So if there was one thing that I will desire that is done, not the most important, but one thing I will desire that is done is for us to learn lessons, and then we act in a way that suggests that we have learned the lessons and we do things differently. If we don't do that, then we will not delay the next pandemic in the health security space. We will not delay the next round of hunger as a result of preventable misplanning for food production and storage. So we learn and we put those lessons into action, we act differently, and then we get better results out of the different actions that we put in place. This would be my desire.
It's called sanity.
You wanted to add, Ms. Mohammed?
Yeah, I wanted to qualify the leadership and be very specific to the group of 20 countries. The G20 is important for them to live up to the responsibilities, and that's where leadership is needed right now, particularly on the means of implementation to get things done.
Dan, what do you think?
Well, I've already talked on the financial side. I think that we need much larger official institutions to play their vital role. Until the governments fund them properly, there's some sensible things that they can and are doing to expand the impact of their existing equity base. There's some other things that I could suggest, but that's more at the margin. But I think that the real initiative should come on the non-financial side. We forget sometimes that the day-to-day work that's done by the World Bank and its sister institutions, as well as the IMF, on policy reform, policy work, is kind of vitally important for improving macroeconomies, for sectorial conditions, to make countries and sectors more investable. We shouldn't lose sight of the vital role that they play day in and day out. Secondly, I mentioned before project development. We could get every bankable project financed. The problem is there aren't enough bankable projects in many, many countries. So more work, more human capital, more input, helping governments develop those projects or helping private sector companies develop bankable projects. And then third, I think that the institutions can do quite a lot to externalize some of the processes that they do for themselves anyway in their regular way business. For example, the ESG risk assessments that they had made led to the Equator Principles about 15 years ago that all of the private sector has since adopted. That's one example. Second, standard setting, I already mentioned with respect to development finance. Third, public procurement. They're really good at managing public procurement processes for the loans that they finance. Let's see that extended more broadly to public procurement so there's a greater efficiency in public spending. Governance and corruption. I think that kind of the World Bank and other institutions like it are doing all sorts of really good work on helping countries root out corrupt systems and kind of removing some of the distortions that lead to corruption. That helps that makes countries much more investable as well. And then finally, they have thousands of people in countries that the private sector or global banks like ourselves don't have. So the information network that they create, finding creative ways to make that known to a broader universe of people about kind of conditions on the ground, I think will also improve kind of investment conditions. But all of this takes budget. Notice I didn't say balance sheet. So one of the things that I would consider is whether or not the official institutions could devote more, or their governance structures could allow them to devote more resources to hiring more staff to do all of these things that we talk about. That doesn't require balance sheet. It just requires people who know what they're doing.
Axel?
Well, I just want to amend maybe the word of Amina from leadership. I would say strategic leadership. We don't need indifferent leadership, what we often see. I think we need to have leadership that is thinking not of tomorrow, but basically long term, because on that you will need to reflect that in international cooperation, and international cooperation will have to be scaled up, and there multilateral organization and multilateralism comes in, because people will need to take a view how important multilateralism is in this century. We're still in the mindset of last century. We need a different way of looking at multilateralism, and then you need scale. You cannot have multilateral at a small scale. The problems are large, and therefore you need to be bolder on this. What it is a very often defensive world where basically everything is defined only in, well, what can I do tomorrow? But basically you need to think long term, and if you are convinced of it, then you have to invest. What often impresses me, after the end of the Second World War, when most countries were poor and were in ashes, there was far more generosity, and there was more strategic thinking. Right now, people are complaining, although we are richer than ever. That is sometimes infuriating, because in front of a problem that is manageable, and when you talk about the billions of dollars that are required over the next 30 years, if you actually calculate that on an annual basis, we are talking maybe of 2-3 percentage points of world GDP. It is not unmanageable. That people then say the trillion is much, but if you look at the world GDP of 100 trillion, it is doable. And I think we have to orient ourselves on this, and therefore you need leadership, and I would say strategic leadership.
Okay, very quickly, we're going to wrap up shortly. Is it all doom and gloom, or is there hope? Axel?
I am an eternal optimist. It's doable. You have to fight.
Minister Ocampo?
No, I certainly doable. By the way, I just want to emphasize one issue that has not been brought up, which is research on agriculture, yes. Particularly to face climate change, which is a major topic for particularly for tropical countries, and also to increase food production in the poor countries.
What was the question? Both of us, we didn't understand the question.
What is this, doom and gloom, or is there hope?
No, of course there's hope. Of course there is hope, but there's no place for complacency.
Yeah.
Absolutely doable if we do things differently, depending on the crisis that we are facing. Only if we do things differently.
Not only doable, but it's happening. And maybe not in a straight line, maybe not as fast as we would wish it to happen, but it is happening.
It's always been doable. It's a question of whether we're going to step up to the plate and do it.
Thank you all so very much. A quick recap before we end our session. So in this age of global crisis with multiple overlapping, interconnected challenges, we need to change our approach. We need to scale up the global response. We must be thinking more multidimensionally, work across borders, and mobilize better across sectors, right, to leverage financing, knowledge, and partnerships. Partnerships and cooperation are key. We must learn from our experiences and do things differently and better. And we need leadership, strategic leadership that is thinking longer term. We heard these wonderful examples from Africa of how that came together during the COVID pandemic, and solutions from Morocco, from Colombia. We need concrete action on the ground. Those words must be translated into solid action. So there is cause for hope together. That brings us to the end of this event. We hope it's been informative and engaging for you. You can watch the replay of this session and our other events at live.worldbank.org/spring meetings 2023. Please do keep sharing your comments online with the hashtag reshaping development. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you for joining us.